My neighbor framed me for a crime, but I exposed their lies in court. You ever have that one neighbor who just seems like they're out to ruin your life? Yeah, I thought I was exaggerating at first, too. I mean, people have misunderstandings, right? But no. My neighbor, let's call him Dave, didn't just make my life miserable, he tried to destroy it. And when I say destroy, I mean he literally tried to frame me for a crime I didn't commit. But the wildest part? I turned the tables on him and exposed his lies in court. And trust me, it wasn't as easy as it sounds. If you've ever had that one person in your life who's been a total nightmare, you're going to want to hear this. Because what started as a petty squabble between neighbors spiraled into the most ridiculous, nerve-wracking, and, let's be honest, satisfying battle of my life. Part 1. The beginning of the nightmare. It all started about a year ago when I moved into my new house. It wasn't some fancy mansion or anything, just a cozy little place with a decent yard and a garage I could finally call my own. I'd saved up for years to afford it, so to say I was excited is an understatement. Everything seemed perfect. The neighbors on one side were friendly retirees who baked me cookies the first week I moved in. The other side? Well, that's where Dave comes in. Dave seemed normal at first. Polite nods when we passed each other, a quick wave when I'd mow the lawn. He looked like your average guy in his late 40s, always tinkering with his truck in the driveway or watering his plants. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then, one day, the first incident happened. I had just put up a small garden bed along the side of my yard, near the property line. I wasn't planting anything crazy, just tomatoes, some herbs, and maybe a few flowers to spruce the place up. I thought it looked nice, but apparently Dave didn't agree. The morning after I finished setting it up, I walked outside to find my garden bed destroyed. The wood was broken, the soil scattered everywhere, and my little tomato plants were crushed. I stood there for a solid minute, just staring at the mess, trying to figure out if a raccoon had gone on a rampage or something. But then I noticed something. Boot prints. Large, muddy boot prints leading straight from Dave's yard into mine. At first, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I mean, accusing your neighbor of vandalism without proof is a pretty bold move. So I decided to play it cool and politely bring it up the next time I saw him. That opportunity came later that day when Dave was outside, hosing down his truck. I walked over and casually said, "Hey Dave, did you happen to see or hear anything weird last night? Someone messed up my garden bed pretty bad." He didn't even pause or look at me. "Nope," he said flatly, spraying water over the hood of his truck, like it was the most important thing in the world. I nodded, trying to keep things friendly. "I noticed some boot prints near the garden. Just thought I'd ask." This time he looked at me, and I swear his expression shifted, like he was annoyed I even dared to ask. Boot prints? Could have been anyone, maybe some kids messing around. The way he brushed it off so quickly rubbed me the wrong way, but I decided to let it go. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe it really was just some random kids, but looking back now, that was just the beginning. Part 2. The escalation. A couple of weeks passed, and I tried to put the garden bed incident behind me. I rebuilt it, planted some new tomatoes, and even added a little fence around it, just in case any kids came back. Everything seemed fine for a while, and I started to settle into my new place again. Then came the noise complaints. It started with a note taped to my door. It was written in all caps, like the person was screaming through the paper, "Keep the noise down! Some of us have to work in the morning." At first, I was confused. Noise? I lived alone, and the loudest thing I did was maybe watch Netflix with the volume slightly above average. I wasn't exactly throwing ragers every night. Still, I figured it must have been some misunderstanding, so I shrugged it off. But then it happened again. This time, Dave himself knocked on my door. It was around 8 p.m., and I'd been watching a movie in my living room. Nothing crazy, no surround sound, just me on my couch with a bowl of popcorn. When I opened the door, Dave stood there with his arms crossed, glaring at me like I'd just committed a war crime. "Do you mind keeping it down?" he snapped. Sure," I said, a bit startled, but I wasn't being that loud. He cut me off. "I can hear it through the walls. It's ridiculous." I didn't know what to say. The houses weren't even that close together, and I wasn't blasting music or anything. Still, I apologized and promised to turn it down, even though I felt like I hadn't done anything wrong. But here's the thing. It didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, I started getting noise complaints almost every other day. Notes on my door, knocks late at night, even a passive-aggressive comment when I ran into Dave at the mailbox. He'd say things like, "Some people have no respect," or "Not everyone lives like a college frat boy, you know?" It got to the point where I was paranoid about making any noise at all. I stopped watching TV after 7 p.m., wore headphones for everything, and even started tiptoeing around my house. But no matter how quiet I was, the complaints kept coming. Then one night, it hit a whole new level. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard a loud banging on my front door. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I scrambled out of bed and peeked through the peephole. And guess who it was? Yep, Dave. I opened the door, and before I could say anything, he started yelling. "I've had it with your crap," he shouted, his face red. "I'm calling the cops if this doesn't stop." I stared at him, completely dumbfounded. "Dave, I'm literally in bed. I haven't made a sound all night," he scoffed, pointing a finger at me like he was accusing me of murder. "Don't play dumb. I heard you, banging and stomping around like you own the place." At that point, I realized there was no reasoning with him. I just shut the door in his face and locked it, my hands shaking. I didn't sleep much that night, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about noise. Dave had some kind of vendetta against me, and I had no idea why. Part 3. The first false accusation. A few days after the late-night door-banging incident, I thought things had calmed down. Dave hadn't knocked on my door or left any notes, so I was cautiously optimistic. Maybe he'd moved on. Or maybe he finally realized I wasn't the party animal he thought I was. That optimism didn't last long. One morning, I woke up to find a police car parked outside my house. My stomach dropped as 2 officers walked up my driveway and knocked on my door. I opened it, trying not to panic, and one of them asked, "Are you the homeowner?" "Yes," I said, my voice shaky. "Is something wrong?" The officer glanced at his partner before answering. "We received a report of loud disturbances and a possible altercation at this address." I blinked, completely thrown. "What? No, there hasn't been anything like that. I live alone and it's been quiet all night." The officer looked me over, as if trying to gauge whether I was lying. "Your neighbor, Mr. Dave," he used his last name, but let's stick with Dave, called us. He said there was shouting and loud noises coming from your house late last night. I stared at him, trying to process what I was hearing. That's not true. I didn't make any noise and there was no shouting. I was asleep. The officers exchanged a look and one of them nodded. "All right, just be aware that if we receive another call, we'll have to investigate further." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and frustration as they walked back to their car. But as soon as they drove off, that relief turned into anger. Dave had crossed a line. It was one thing to complain about noise, but filing a false police report? That was next-level crazy. I decided it was time to confront him. I marched over to his house and knocked on his door, my heart pounding. He opened it with the same smug expression he always had, like he'd been waiting for me. "What do you want?" he said, crossing his arms. "You called the cops on me?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't even flinch. "Yeah, you were being loud again. I couldn't sleep." I stared at him, completely baffled. "Dave, I wasn't making any noise. You're lying, and you know it." He shrugged, giving me a smirk that made my blood boil. "Prove it." I stood there, speechless. How do you prove you didn't make noise? It was my word against his, and he knew it. I realized right then and there that he wasn't just being difficult. He was actively trying to make my life miserable. But why? I still didn't understand what I'd done to make him hate me so much. As I walked back to my house, I made a decision. If Dave wanted a fight, he was going to get one. I wasn't going to let him bully me into silence, and I definitely wasn't going to let him ruin my life. Part 4. Gathering Evidence. After that run-in with the cops, I knew I couldn't let Dave keep pulling these stunts without some kind of pushback. If he was going to make false accusations, I needed proof to defend myself. So, I did what anyone with a bone to pick and a credit card would do. I bought a home security system. I picked a system that included cameras with night vision and motion sensors, and I installed them around my house. Front door, backyard, driveway, the works. I even set up one inside my living room, just in case Dave got any wild ideas about claiming I was throwing wild parties. Once everything was in place, I felt a little more at ease. If Dave tried anything again, I'd have cold, hard evidence to back me up. For a while, the cameras seemed to be working as a deterrent. Dave kept his distance, and I didn't hear a peep from him. No late-night knocks, no notes, no police visits. I almost started to think the whole thing was over. Then one night, I caught him in the act. It was around midnight, and I was in bed scrolling on my phone when I got a notification from the security app. Motion detected in backyard. My heart immediately started racing. I opened the app and pulled up the live feed. And there he was, Dave, standing in my yard with a flashlight, inspecting my garden bed like he owned the place. I watched as he bent down and started messing with the fence I'd put around the garden. At first, I thought he might be trying to rip it out, but then I realized he was planting something. He placed a small object near the base of one of my tomato plants, then stood up and walked back toward his yard like nothing had happened. My hands were shaking as I saved the footage and called the non-emergency police line. When the officer arrived, I showed him the video. "My neighbor's been harassing me for weeks," I explained, "and now he's trespassing on my property and messing with my garden." The officer nodded, clearly taking it seriously. He knocked on Dave's door, and after a few minutes of arguing, Dave came outside, acting all innocent. "I wasn't in his yard," Dave insisted, his voice dripping with fake indignation. "He's just trying to make me look bad." The officer turned to me, and I handed him my phone. "I have it on camera," I said, trying not to sound too smug. Dave's face turned pale when the officer watched the footage. That's not me," he stammered, but his voice lacked any real conviction. The officer gave him a look that could have melted steel. "Stay off his property," he said firmly. "If I get another call about this, you'll be facing trespassing charges." Dave mumbled something under his breath and slammed his door shut. As the officer left, I felt a small wave of satisfaction. Finally, Dave's antics were starting to catch up with him. But little did I know, this was just the warm-up act. Part 5. Dave's Revenge. For a brief moment, I thought the security cameras had scared Dave off for good. Days went by, then weeks, and everything was quiet. No notes, no complaints, no mysterious police visits. I almost started to feel normal again. But with Dave, the quiet was just the calm before the storm. One Saturday morning, I walked out to my driveway to grab the mail, and that's when I saw it. A bright orange sticker plastered across my car's windshield. My stomach dropped as I walked closer and read the words, "Abandoned Vehicle Notice." Confused, I looked around. My car was parked in my driveway, right where it always was. There was nothing illegal about it, and it definitely wasn't abandoned. I peeled the sticker off and checked the small print. It said the notice was issued because of complaints about an unused vehicle being an eyesore. I didn't even need to guess who had made the complaint. Fuming, I called the local parking authority to clear things up. After explaining the situation, they told me the complaint had come from a concerned neighbor and that they'd been required to issue the notice, but it would be removed from their records since my car was clearly parked on private property. I hung up, feeling a mix of relief and anger. Dave had gone from petty harassment to actively trying to cause real problems for me, and he wasn't done yet. That same week, I came home from work to find another surprise. A city inspector was standing on my lawn, clipboard in hand, staring at my house like it was about to collapse. "Hi, can I help you?" I asked, cautiously approaching. The inspector looked up and said, "We received a complaint about unpermitted construction on your property." My jaw dropped. "What?" "I haven't done any construction." He nodded, flipping through his paperwork. "Your neighbor reported excessive noise and claims you've been building an illegal structure in your backyard." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I walked him over to my backyard, where my little garden bed and patio were the only structures in sight. After a quick look around, the inspector shook his head. "There's nothing here that violates code. Sorry for the inconvenience." As he left, I felt a fresh wave of rage bubbling up inside me. This wasn't just a neighborly feud anymore. Dave was trying to weaponize the system against me. But the thing about systems is, they leave a paper trail. That night, I started documenting everything. The complaints, the calls, the police visits, and now the city inspector. I organized my security footage, saved copies of every note and sticker, and wrote down detailed timelines of every incident. If Dave wanted to play dirty, fine. But I wasn't going to let him win. Part 6. The Breaking Point. I wish I could say things got better after I started documenting everything, but if anything, they got worse. It was like Dave realized his usual tactics weren't working and decided to double down. A few days after the city inspector visit, I woke up to find my garbage cans tipped over and trash scattered all over my driveway. At first, I thought it might have been raccoons, but when I checked the security footage, there was Dave, casually knocking the cans over as he walked by in the middle of the night. I called the non-emergency line again, and the officer I spoke to seemed sympathetic. But without major damages or evidence of repeated trespassing, there wasn't much they could do. Just keep documenting, he advised. It felt like Dave knew exactly how far he could push, without crossing a line that would get him into real trouble. The final straw came about a week later. I'd just gotten home from work when my phone buzzed with another motion alert. I opened the app, expecting to see something minor, but my blood ran cold. There was smoke coming from my backyard. I bolted outside, heart pounding, and saw flames licking up the side of my garden fence. It wasn't a huge fire yet, but it was big enough to set off every alarm in my head. I grabbed the hose and started dousing the flames, my mind racing. Once the fire was out, I checked the damage. It wasn't too bad, just some charred wood and melted plastic, but it was obvious the fire hadn't started on its own. I checked the footage, and sure enough, there was Dave again, tossing something over the fence and hurrying back to his yard. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was dangerous. I called the police, and this time, they took it seriously. The officer who arrived watched the footage with me, his expression growing darker by the second. "We'll take care of this," he said firmly. Dave was arrested that evening. It wasn't a dramatic scene, just two officers knocking on his door and leading him away in handcuffs. But I felt a sense of vindication, watching him get taken into custody. But here's the thing about people like Dave. They don't go down without a fight. Part 7. The Courtroom Drama. It didn't take long for Dave to lawyer up. As soon as I heard he'd hired an attorney, I knew this was about to get a lot more complicated. He wasn't going to just accept the consequences of his actions. He was going to fight tooth and nail, even if it meant dragging me through the mud. The court date was set for a few weeks after his arrest, and I spent every day preparing. I reviewed my notes, collected all my evidence, photos, security footage, police reports, and even hired my own lawyer. I didn't want to take any chances, especially since I knew Dave was going to pull out all the stops to paint me as the bad guy. On the day of the trial, I walked into the courtroom, heart racing. The whole thing felt surreal, like a bad dream. I had never imagined my neighbor would take me to court over something so petty, let alone try to accuse me of crimes I didn't commit. But there I was, sitting on one side, ready to prove my innocence, while Dave and his lawyer sat across from me. The trial began, and Dave's attorney wasted no time spinning a story that made it seem like I was some kind of criminal mastermind. He claimed I had been harassing Dave for months, disrupting his life with loud noises, damaging his property, and even threatening him. It was all a load of crap, but the way he said it, you could tell he was trying to plant doubt in the minds of the jury. Then it was my turn. I stood up and calmly walked to the witness stand, trying to ignore the sweat that was already forming on my palms. My lawyer walked me through the timeline of events, presenting my evidence piece by piece. The photos of the vandalized garden, the police reports, the video footage of Dave trespassing, and, of course, the footage of him setting the fire. When the security footage of the fire was played, I could see Dave's face on the screen, clearly identifiable as he tossed something into my yard. His lawyer tried to argue that it wasn't conclusive proof, but it was hard to deny that it was his client on the footage. But then came the twist. Dave's lawyer called in a witness, a friend of Dave's who had supposedly seen me threatening Dave. The witness claimed I'd gone over to Dave's house one night, shouting at him and threatening to burn his house down. The moment I heard that, I almost lost it. But I'd anticipated this. I'd already checked the background of this so-called witness, and surprise, surprise, he had a history of being involved in petty disputes with neighbors. He was also one of Dave's best friends. It didn't take much for my lawyer to show that this witness was anything but credible. In the end, it wasn't just the evidence that worked in my favor. It was the fact that Dave's own lies were catching up to him. The more his lawyer pushed, the more holes we found in their story. Dave tried to spin one last lie, claiming I'd planted the fire footage myself. But by then, it was clear to everyone that he was out of options. The jury deliberated for just over an hour. When they came back, the verdict was clear. Dave was guilty of harassment, trespassing, and arson. He was ordered to pay for the damages to my property and a hefty fine, and he faced probation for the arson charge. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt like I'd just run a marathon. It wasn't just about winning. It was about finally standing up for myself and showing that I wouldn't let someone like Dave get away with ruining my life. Part 8. The Aftermath. Winning in court felt like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders, but the aftermath was more complicated than I expected. Sure, Dave had been found guilty, but that didn't mean things were over. The tension in the neighborhood didn't magically disappear. In fact, things became a little more awkward, if anything. For one, Dave's house was just a few feet away from mine, so avoiding him was impossible. For a while, he stayed hidden behind closed blinds, but I could feel his eyes on me every time I stepped outside. The subtle glares, the lingering presence when I was walking to my car, even the occasional muttered insult if our paths crossed. He wasn't done with me, not by a long shot. But what was I supposed to do? I had already exposed him for what he really was. I had stood up for myself in court. I wasn't going to let him make me feel scared anymore. I had my peace of mind back, and that was worth more than anything else. One day, about a month after the trial, I got a letter in the mail from Dave. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the return address. The letter was brief, but it felt like the final attempt at some kind of closure. "Dear my name," it started, "I'm sorry for what I did. I was wrong to treat you that way. I've spent some time thinking about my actions and the consequences, and I regret everything. I hope we can move forward as neighbors without any further conflict. Sincerely, Dave." I couldn't believe it at first. It was so out of the blue, like a complete 180 from the man who'd been terrorizing me for months. My initial reaction was a mix of disbelief and frustration. He had tried to ruin my life, and now he was trying to play the victim? But then, I thought about it more. I didn't need his apology. What mattered was that I had already taken the steps to protect myself. And I didn't need to let his words manipulate me into letting my guard down again. I never responded to the letter. I didn't need to. I wasn't going to allow Dave to pretend like everything was fine after everything he had put me through. But there was one thing I realized from all this. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is stand up for yourself, especially when it feels like the world is stacked against you. It's not about winning the battle, it's about holding your ground. Part 9. The Lesson Learned. Life slowly began to return to normal after everything with Dave. The quiet was almost refreshing, but in a way, I couldn't shake the lessons I'd learned from the whole ordeal. First of all, I realized how easy it is to let someone walk all over you if you don't set boundaries. At the start, I tried to be the nice neighbor, the easygoing guy who didn't want to make waves. But that approach had only made things worse. If I had stood my ground sooner, maybe I could have avoided a lot of the drama. Another lesson? Trust, but verify. I had trusted Dave's passive-aggressive complaints as just normal neighbor drama at first. It never occurred to me that someone would go this far to make my life miserable, but when the complaints kept coming, I should have started documenting everything sooner. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to have proof when dealing with situations like this, especially when the other person is willing to lie at every turn. And finally, I learned that you don't have to fight fire with fire. You don't have to stoop to someone's level just to get back at them. I could have escalated the situation, let my anger take over, but in the end, what worked was standing my ground and letting the legal system do its job. I didn't need to get petty. I didn't need to sink to Dave's level. All I needed was patience, a clear head, and a solid defense. As for the neighborhood, things remained tense for a while. Some neighbors still took Dave's side, or at least acted like they were neutral, not wanting to get involved. But for the most part, life went on. The neighborhood didn't become a hostile environment, but it definitely wasn't the warm, welcoming place I had imagined when I first moved in. Eventually, Dave moved away. I'm not sure where he went, but I didn't care. His presence in the neighborhood had become toxic. And while I was never thrilled about the idea of a neighbor moving out, in this case, it was a relief. Looking back on it now, I'm proud of how I handled the situation. It was tough, mentally and emotionally draining, but I didn't let it break me. And if you're ever in a similar spot, whether it's with a neighbor, coworker, or anyone else who tries to tear you down, remember, you don't have to let them win. Stand up for yourself, keep your integrity, and take the high road. In the end, that's the only victory that matters. Part 10. moving on and reflecting. It's been a few years since all that drama with Dave, and honestly, I don't think about it much anymore, at least not in the way I used to. It was a chapter in my life that taught me more than I ever expected to learn. It wasn't just about defending myself from a toxic neighbor, but about growing as a person. The whole ordeal opened my eyes to the types of people who will go to extreme lengths to manipulate others for their own gain. Dave was a master at turning small things into big problems and then playing the victim. He thrived on conflict. It took me a while to realize that his behavior wasn't about me, it was about him. His insecurities, his need to control, his inability to deal with his own life. But once I understood that, it was easier to let go of the anger. I could see him for what he was. A man who used petty tactics to feel powerful, because he lacked real strength in other areas of his life. It wasn't about me being the enemy, it was about him being deeply unhappy and unable to deal with it in a healthy way. In the years since, I've learned to spot these kinds of people early on. I've set better boundaries, I've become more confident in standing up for myself, and I've surrounded myself with people who respect me for who I am. That's probably the most important lesson I learned from all of this. And as for the neighborhood, it's quieter now. I don't have any other neighbors who go out of their way to cause drama. There's peace in knowing I'm in a space where people don't try to pull me into their personal issues. If anything, I've made a point to be more involved in the community, though in a positive way. I volunteer for local events and even started a small book club to bring people together. It's funny how life has a way of bringing you back to where you need to be after a storm. When I moved into this neighborhood, I thought it was just a place to live, a home to settle into. I never imagined I'd have to fight so hard just to feel safe and respected, but I'm glad I did. I came out of the other side of that storm stronger, and now I know that no matter what happens, I can handle it. And if you're reading this and dealing with a situation that feels like it's too big to overcome, take it from me, don't give up. People like Dave only win if you let them. Stand your ground, protect your peace, and know that you have the strength to overcome. It's your life. Don't let anyone take that from you.